We're not going to go any farther than that, But you think about it, clothes. It's interesting. The clothing and fashion in general has made a statement, or has made some strides since when Adam and Eve first made clothes, right? What did they use? Fig leaves, right? Leaves to cover up their nakedness. Clothing has gone from something you use to covering up your nakedness to something to express yourself, your style, your personality, whether through a certain brand, whether you're a Nike guy or an Adidas girl, or we all have our favorite brands that we like to run to. So we use clothes not just to cover our nakedness, but we use clothes to impress others. There's certain clothes that we will put on, a certain style or a certain dress that we will put on when we go in for an interview with our potential boss. We wear our trendiest clothes for dates. I mean, we dress up for the tuxes when we go to weddings, or when we're in weddings, or when we go to prom. We dress to impress while we're with that person. When I was growing up, I was taught you wear your Sunday best when going to church. How many people were taught with that? If you were raised in church, mostly all of us. You wear your Sunday best while going to church because it was a measure of reverence, out of reverence for the Lord. But where does that concept derive, really? I mean, that God really does care about what you have on, about your dress and your style and all of that. That you have to have a certain way of dressing before you can worship Him. I believe it's an innate respect for God that our parents had, that they had this understanding, this reverence for the Lord. And for that, I'm very grateful. But I also believe for some of us, the root of it derives from a teaching from 3 millennia ago, from 3,000 years ago, that we're going to be looking at in the book of Exodus, in the context of worship and in the presence of God. What does God require of us now that we are His people? Can we just wear anything? Can we just walk into His presence? Or are there certain things that we have to have right before we can worship Him in His presence? Now, we're going to be looking at a particular passage and some of the instructions that God gives His people. What we have to understand is, before we jump into this in Exodus, is that God needed to teach His people several things. This relationship with God and His people were relatively new. They were still trying to figure out who this Lord, who this God is. And so there were some things that He had to teach His people. He had to teach His people that He was holy, that there was no other God like Him, that there was no other thing or no other being like God who is holy. And He was going to do it in a way that people of antiquity could understand, that they could wrap their minds around. He was going to do it by way of things they could touch. He was going to do it by way of things that they could actually see and hear. He was going to give them examples through many different types of object lessons. And they needed to understand His greatness. They needed to understand truly His power and His majesty and His holiness and His worthiness of worship. If He was going to be their God, and if they were going to be His people. So by this time, we're going to be in Exodus 19 for a little bit. So by this time, God had delivered His people out of Egypt. He saved them from Pharaoh. He caused the Red Sea to part when Pharaoh's army was pursuing them. And so they made the crossing, and they're beginning to somewhat get settled into their routine. And then the Lord calls out Moses, and He says this in Exodus 19, because what God's getting ready to do is getting ready to lay the foundation of a covenantal agreement between Himself and His people. That if they want to be His people, and if He is going to be their God, there are some expectations, some instructions they need to follow. And so when we come to Exodus 19, we see this in the first part of verse 10. He said, the Lord speaks to Moses and He says, "Go down and prepare the people for my arrival." So God's getting ready to enter into their presence. Go down and prepare the people for my arrival. Consecrate them today. That is, set them apart, set them aside, and tomorrow. And have them, notice that, wash their clothing. Be sure they are ready on the third day, for on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai as all the people watch. Now, not only do they have to wash their clothes, Moses, make sure the people mark off a boundary all around the mountain. Warn the people, be careful, do not go up on the mountain or even touch its boundaries. Anyone who touches the mountain will certainly be put to death. No hand may touch the person or animal that crosses the boundary. Instead, get this, stone them or shoot them with arrows. They must be put to death. However, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, then the people may go up on the mountain. So Moses went down to the people. He consecrated them for worship, and they washed their clothes. Now, already, guys, for those of you who raised your hand, who said you don't like washing your clothes, y'all would have been dead the first day. So y'all would have only been Israelites for maybe like a day or so. But then, if you read this, there are certain expectations. Again, God is communicating to his people. Not that he really cared that whether or not their clothes were dirty or whatever, but he's communicating to them that he is a holy God. He's a God of majesty. There is no other God like him. And he can't allow impurities into his presence. So you can imagine the burden, the weight that the people felt. If you were given this instruction, if I came knocking on your door this morning and said, hey, make sure you wash your clothes, and you need to set yourself apart, and you have to do this, and don't touch that, and don't look at that, or you will die before you come today to worship. What would that feeling, what would that do to you in your heart? So this isn't some light instruction. The people understood that they were about to enter into the presence of the Almighty God. And you read like in Leviticus where, because Aaron's sons came, they approached God's presence in a wrong way, in an irreverent way, God struck them down. So this isn't, entering into God's presence isn't a light deal here. Us coming together to worship isn't a light thing that we do. And these are just minor instructions. As you read throughout Exodus, my word, as you start there like in chapter 25, God begins to then give instructions about the tabernacle. What is the tabernacle? Basically, it was just this huge tent. It's this big tent. The word tabernacle is actually a Greek word. The word tabernacle gives us the idea that it's a dwelling. That's what it means. It means a dwelling. And so in John 1:14, where it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that means the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And so it gives them instructions. So, okay, now you're going to have this tabernacle. You're going to build this tent. And in the tabernacle, I will dwell. There in the tabernacle, I will dwell. If people want to come and worship me, they need to come into the tabernacle. He gives them this plans for all the furnishings of the tabernacle. And it is not like you can just round the edges or estimate. He gives them precise measurements that he expects for people. If they're going to worship him, they have to do it this certain way. He gives them plans for the altar and how to construct the altar, that if they're going to offer their sacrifices to the Lord, they need to offer it on the right kind of altar. Not just any kind of altar will suffice, because he is a holy, holy, majestic, powerful God.